Greetings, this is the Questing GM. So welcome back to another RPG study hour for the Star Trek Adventures Quick Start guide. And today we will be going into what could probably be the last session for this rule sets. As you can see, we have only about 3 pages left. And in the last video, we started the conflict chapter. We learned a little bit about what are the encounters, the definition of encounters, and what are the actions that can be taken. They are minor actions as well as combat tasks. And now we will get into some people's most favorite part of a combat rules is the actual resolution of attacks and damages. There's a list of steps that's involved in resolving attacks. So it can be a complicated, but hopefully it's complicated in a very fun way to do these attacks. And obviously they are also momentum plays a role in combat as well as in normal tasks. And then we'll see into the last areas we learn about types of attacks, and particularly under the damage effects, which I think it would be has a lot of factors involving the weapons that's being used in the Star Trek Adventure games. So let's start with attacks and damages. Okay, so the process for making an attack is as follows. Step 1, the attack chooses a weapon for the attack. This can be a ranged weapon, a melee weapon, or attacking with no weapon, an unarmed strike. Number 2, the attacker then nominates a viable target for that weapon. A weapon or an unarmed strike can only be used to attack enemies and objects within reach. A ranged weapon can be used to attack enemies that are visible to the attacker. So this is a very interesting point here, that the only condition for a ranged attack is it has to be visible. Whether there's any sort of visibility rules that comes into play later on, I suspect it will not be in the quick start, that's for sure. But whether that's something that's covered in the core rules will be something that we might need to pay a bit of attention to. Alright, step number 3, the character declares whether the attack is intended to be lethal or non-lethal or lethal. If the character intends to make a lethal attack, add a single point to the threat pool. Now this is obviously in contrast with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, where the melee attacker gets to decide whether the attack or the damage that's being dealt is supposed to be lethal or non-lethal for situations when you want to just knock someone unconscious for further questioning rather than kill them outright. But in Star Trek Adventures, they decided to put that decision way earlier, and I think the good reason for that is because if you're deciding to kill someone, making a lethal attack, then you are actually adding a threat pool. So I'm not exactly sure what kind of scenario where it would be a good idea to actually kill someone in Star Trek, in the setting of Star Trek Adventures and in the logic of Star Trek Adventures. It's probably not something that happens very often in the course of a season of a show. So I guess it's supposed to be taken with some sort of gravity, that this is supposed to be a very significant moment when a character decides that the best course of action is actually to kill someone. Alright, so step number 4, the attacker attempts a task determined by the type of attack. For a melee attack, that's A, the attacker attempts a daring plus security task with a difficulty of 1, opposed by the target's daring plus security, also difficulty 1. If the target wins the opposed task, then they are considered to have made a successful attack instead. So I'm not sure if we've been introduced to this concept of opposed task. I don't think not into my recollection as of now. And it's actually because I don't remember them being an opposed task, I'm not exactly sure how it works. But if I just have to guess, it's probably something like a comparison of number of successes, and I'm guessing the one with the higher number of success is the one who's successful. But then again, there is still a default difficulty of 1 for both sides. And the interesting thing here is that if the target wins the opposed task, they are considered to make a successful attack instead. So it's actually a two-way resolution. You can, in a sense, see both sides making an attack, and it's a determination of whose attack goes through. But I'm a bit concerned of this opposed task here because I really probably should check back if there is an opposed task that's explained earlier, but otherwise then this would actually be a huge rules gap in the quick start, in the sense that it doesn't really there is no proper explanation of how the melee attack works that's found within the rule set itself. So yeah, but probably whoever's watching this who has a better knowledge of the Star Trek core rules may just chime in and clarify things for me. Okay. B, for range attack, the attacker attempts a control plus security task with a difficulty of 2. This is not an opposed task. The difficulty of this task increases by 1 if there is an enemy within reach of the attacker. The complication range of the attack increases by 1 if there are creatures within reach of the target. The complication may indicate that one of the other nearby creature is struck by the attack. So we have a base so the base difficulty for a range attack is 2, which is, and it's increased by 1 if there's an enemy within reach, which I believe is mentioned earlier in the conflicts chapter, that what happens when there's a character within reach. So it definitely, having someone within reach definitely is a disadvantage when it comes to range attacks. Complication range is another term that looks new to me. Although in this case, I think it's quite easily understood that it's only meant to be applied in a situation where there are more creatures within the reach of the target. So, if there's at least like a couple characters standing side by side, then this is where the complication range comes in and can increase the difficulty by another 1. So based on these rules alone, we are looking at a potential scenario of difficulty up to 4. 2 being the base, 1 being someone within reach of the attacker, and another being within reach of the target. But the complication range here, this is another potential gap in the rules that we are not exactly sure how it's supposed to come in, although there is a hint of it that it may involve targeting the other creature within reach is the one that's being struck by the attack rather than the intended target. Again, I'm reading both of these rules combined, it actually brings out a little bit of concern in me, that this quick start hopefully really explains itself better, or can be explained a lot more better than by checking terms that are being thrown around, that they have to make sure that it's covered at some point. Alright, step number 5. If the attack is successful, the attack inflicts damage. Roll the number of challenge dice for the attack or hazard's damage rating. The total roll is amount of damage the character or hazard inflicts. So this is generally, basically, I guess it's dependent on the weapon. And if you recall the video that we did on the characters, and we started looking at the pre-gens, and each character definitely has weapons they carry. Each weapon dealing various amounts of damage. I believe we were looking at a range between 2 to 7, around there. So, and also remember that this is a challenge dice, so the maximum amount that the dice can do is only 2, or a 1 plus an effect. So we are not looking at a really high looking at really high numbers here. If the highest number is indeed 7, then we're looking at a maximum of 14 damage. But then again, 14 damage is way above the normal number of stress that a character has. At least in the ones in the pre-gens, at least they have only about like 9 or 12 between them, or I think 15 was the most. So damage, I think, is the damage that is inflicted is generally supposed to be kept, I would believe, somewhere between the less than 20 range. But that could change, in the core rules if there's more stress being allowed to build up, or there's a progression in the number of stress on damage that can be dealt. Okay, step 6. If the target has any resistance dice from cover and the like, roll those dice and add the total roll to the character's static resistance, if any. The total is the character's total resistance for that attack. Again, we are introduced to another new concept of resistance dice, and as I mentioned before, seems to be rules implying for cover, but as I said, we've never encountered any of these rules yet. And the fact that they mentioned resistance dice, and I think this was something that might have been something we saw in the pre-gens. Maybe now is a good time to go back to some of the pre-gens and have a look and see if some of these concepts actually apply in the context of these attacks and damages. Let's take a quick look. Let's just take the first officer. If he has any resistance, so he has a resistance of 0, and I believe it's pretty much the same for everyone. So I'm not sure if there's anything, if there's a good example here. Resistance 1. This is our combat expert. Yeah, who's resistance 0. So the thing is, the question now is, resistance 0, is this an indication of 0 resistance dice, or is this an indication of 0 resistance? Which I believe may be something that is used to reduce the amount of damage, you know, as rolled in step 5. So because, as you said, if there's any resistance dice, you add the total roll to the character's static resistance, if any, which in this case, in most cases, I would believe for the quick start, there are none. So it's more of a question of what exactly is this resistance dice, and I'm guessing it's coming from things like cover, and I'm guessing it's also something that is circumstantial in the sense that only certain situations you granted the resistance dice, and step 6 only becomes relevant if you have that. Otherwise, for the rest of the quick start, I think step 6 is probably the one that is probably going to be most ignored in most situations, unless you know the adventure states otherwise. Alright, step 7, reduce the total damage rolled by 1 for each point of total resistance. Okay, as I said, once you have any known number of resistance, that is the number that you reduce the damage that's been dealt. If there is 1 or more damage remaining after this reduction, the character loses 1 point of stress for each point of remaining damage. The character may also suffer an injury if 1 or more of the following conditions occur. A. If the character suffers 5 or more damage from a single attack or hazard after reduction from resistance, the character suffers an injury. B. If the character is reduced to 0 stress by that attack or hazard, they suffer an injury. C. If the character has 0 stress before the attack or hazard, and the attack or hazard inflicts 1 or more damage, the character suffers an injury. If 2 of the conditions occur, the character suffers 2 injuries, resolve 1 at a time. When a character suffers an injury, that is, they are incapacitated. They cannot carry out any minor actions or attempt any task for the remainder of the scene. A character that suffers a second injury when already suffering from a non-lethal injury now suffers from a lethal injury instead. A character then suffers an injury while already suffering from a lethal injury is dead. When the character suffers an injury, they have the option to avoid it, as they can dive aside at the last moment, duck into cover, or otherwise dodge out of the way. Avoiding an injury in this way has a price. It costs 2 momentum immediate, or requires the character suffer a complication, minor injury, collateral damage, etc. A character may only avoid an injury once per scene, though they may regain the ability up to 1 use by taking the recover task. A character who succeeds in a melee attack when they were the attacker or the target can immediately leave their enemy's reach instead of inflicting damage. The character fends off their opponent instead of attacking. Alright, so that's that. That was a really long, that was a really thick step 7, which is the final step. So everything seems to check out, everything seems to make sense, although the paragraphs on injury is actually was a little bit heavy. So if I'm understanding this correctly, given a basic scenario, you know, if the character doesn't start out with any kind of injury, if they're dealt 5 or more damage after resistance, then they suffer an injury. If they are reduced to 0 stress, they suffer an injury. If they already are at 0 stress and they take only 1 damage, then they suffer an injury. So in a typical scenario, you incur an injury from any of these 3 scenarios. That means you have 1 injury, and it is possible for you to get 2 injuries from any of the 2 conditions. So I guess the most likely example is if you are reduced to 0 stress, and then you suffer another 1 more damage after 0 stress. Or another typical scenario would be if, let's say, you took 5 damage and that reduced you down to 0 stress. then you would suffer 2 injuries straight away simultaneously, although it does have a line here that says it's resolve one at a time. I'm not exactly, based on what I've read so far, I'm not exactly sure if there's any reason for the order of resolution injuries. I guess maybe it comes in when you suffer a second injury when already suffering from a non-lethal injury now. Okay, so the danger point here is they suddenly throw in this idea of a non-lethal and lethal injury. Is this something that is related with non-lethal and lethal attacks? Is this also an assumption that every first injury is a non-lethal injury, or it can be a lethal injury if the character decides it to be so? And what are the difference between a non-lethal injury and a lethal injury? And also the fact that if you suffer 2 lethal injuries, or at least an injury, it doesn't even say a lethal injury. So if you already have a lethal injury and you suffer another injury, lethal or not, you are dead. So this is the bottom line of how lethal injuries are in the game. So you can basically only have, the limitation I guess is that you can only have 2 lethal injuries at a time. Well, actually no, that's, you can only have 1 lethal injury at a time, and any injury it occurs after that is actually the danger line is actually on the lethal injury. And if you already have a non-lethal injury, a second injury would have turned into a lethal injury. So you can actually take at most 3 non-lethal injuries. That, if I understand correctly, you can take up to 3 non-lethal injuries, and you can take up to before death, and you can take up to 2 lethal injuries before death. Yeah, I guess that should be, that sounds a bit yeah, that sounds about right. But if anyone knows better, yeah, clarify. Let's help can clarify that in the comments somewhere. All right. And also, if you have an injury, the other important point is, I think if you have an injury, you cannot carry out minor actions or perform tasks for the remainder of the scene. So there is a really heavy prerogative to want to remove any injuries, and that's where this second part of the rules comes in, that you can actually use the avoid an injury task. And I'm trying to remember, is this a, I believe this is a combat task. This is not a minor action. Let me just take a quick check. Let me see if I can avoiding an injury. So no, there's avoiding an injury is not stated here, but I seem to recall seeing it somewhere in one of the videos. But there is that important factor where you actually use the recover to regain your ability for avoiding an injury. Okay, so it seems that maybe that's under combat momentum spans. That we'll see about that later. Well, in any case, if you want to avoid injury, you have to spend 2 immediate momentums. Now I'm not exactly sure where does this momentum come from. Does it come from the melee attacks when you made the daring securities, or is there a, or does it, or in the case that if someone makes a range attack at you, you have no way of gaining any momentums to spend on avoiding an injury? I suspect that's not the case. I don't think that's the intended design for it. You can just spend momentum as long as it's available. Although that's why I'm not exactly sure how is this immediate part here related with. I think I'm having some trouble trying to understand the timing of when you can spend momentum. Like, can you spend moment? I don't think it doesn't sound to me that there's an intended restriction on that you can only spend momentums when they are generated and when they can be used. I think as long as you have momentum in the pool, you can just spend momentum as much as you want. there's no really restriction on the timing of when to gain and when to spend. So that's, but you know, based on my reading so far, that seems to be a quite a muddled message, and I'm not exactly sure why. Is there any real meaning behind uh, uh, distincting between immediate and repeatable, uh, and why not just say something like as long as you can just spend 2 momentum. So I hope someone, you know, I hope that will be clarified maybe within the rules, maybe, and I just need to read it a few more times just to get a better picture, or maybe there's something that's being applied behind the mechanics that I'm not seeing right now. All right, so the cost of using the avoid an injury is either to spend 2 momentum or to gain and suffer a complication, and you can only do it once per scene, uh, but you can recover that. You can regain the ability by recover with a melee task. This is another section here. This is only related with melee attacks, which says that once if you succeed on a melee attack, you can choose to disengage from a reach range with the opponent, whether that's a target or whether you're the defender, and you do not inflict damage instead. So I guess this is most likely going to be happens when you are being the target of a melee attack, and instead of, you know, counter attacking your attacker, you may choose to use your successes to divert and try to disengage from the attacker instead, possibly in a situation where you are probably not as competent in melee attacks as your opponent. Okay, so we'll move on to the next section of the rules, which is combat momentum spans. So momentum is a key tactical resource during combat. When a character generates momentum in combat, they have numerous options available to overcome their enemies, empower their allies, or bolster their own prowess. The table below provides additional options available to a character when they generate 1 or more momentum in combat. These are in addition to the normal uses of momentum and any other that players or the GM creates. Under cost, where a span is listed with an R, it is repeatable. Where the span is listed with an I, it means the span is immediate. If neither node is present, then the momentum span may only be used once per round at most. Okay, so that takes us down to this table right here, and on the surface it actually looks very similar to, you know, the stun system from the age system from Green Ronin, but instead of, you know, gaining access to the abilities of this table through dice rolls, which is a deliberate decision that can be done with successes, although that in some ways it still depends on the dice rolls. All right, so we have how many options? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So avoid an injury is one of those options. So I guess you can only use avoid an injury when you generate momentum. Okay, so let's look at the first one. Bonus damage cost is 1 repeatable. Character can increase the damage inflicted by a successful attack regardless of the type of attack. Each momentum spent adds 1 damage, and this is repeatable, so it's one momentum for 1 damage. Disarm at the cost of 2 momentum. 1 weapon held by the target is knocked away and falls to the ground within reach. Extra minor actions, 1 momentum for repeatable and immediate. Take additional minor actions. Keep the initiative at 2 for immediate. Pass the action order to another ally instead of the enemy. May only be done once before the enemy has taken at least 1 turn. So this part makes sense to me. Initiative is a side-to-side thing, in the sense that a player character starts first, then it's off the enemy, and then back to the player characters, and then back to the enemy, and it goes goes on. So keep the initiative is actually in a situation where if after you've acted and after the player has acted and they decided to spend momentum for keep the initiative, then the next person who acts is actually on the player character's side, rather than, you know, going to the enemy. Although I'm not exactly sure what is this mean, but may only be done once the enemy has taken at least 1 turn. So I'm guessing this cannot be something that can be used on the first turn of the player character. In round 1, when the player character starts, they cannot use the keep the initiative combat momentum until at least 1 other enemy has acted before that. So it means on the first player on the first turn may not be able to do it, but the second player on what we're talking, maybe the third turn, will be able to use keep the initiative to benefit the third player. Alright, penetration, cost of 1 momentum, repeatable. The damage inflicted by the current attack ignores 2 resistance for each momentum spent. So this is actually quite a big deal, in assuming that if the target has a resistance, and technically that actually can negate even a resistance dice, because remember, as a resistance dice maximum number is 2, so by just spending 1 momentum they can actually negate the cover, say the cover from the resistance dice of the target. Reroll damage, which is 1 momentum. The player may reroll any number of challenge dice from the current attack. Alright, that sounds simple enough. Although this is not repeatable, and so there's a comparison between reroll damage and bonus damage. So it may be prudent to want to reroll any number of challenge dice with just 1 momentum, when you only have 1 momentum, compared to using 1 momentum to increase damage by 1 if you only have 1 momentum generated. Alright, avoid an injury. So this is 2 momentum as an immediate. Avoid suffering a single injury. The cost may be paid by suffering a complication instead, which is interesting, because I think this is a little bit different from how momentum is the counter currency of momentum is actually threats. So normally you can actually just give more threats to the GM to pay the cost of momentum. But in this case, to avoid injury, you have to give a complication instead of giving threats. Other factors may increase the cost further, may only be used once per scene, though additional uses can be obtained. And in this case, it's using the recovery action, minor action. Alright, secondary target, cost of 2 momentum. A second target within reach of the target's attack is also affected by the attack and suffers half the attack's damage, rounding down. Alright, this sounds pretty straightforward. And then we have swift task. 2 momentum costs. The character may attempt 1 additional task, increasing the difficulty by 1 over what the task would normally require. Okay, so it looks like on a general idea, the highest cost is actually around 2, and the benefits that usually come with those momentum spend is actually pretty significant. The interesting ones that I find is actually swift task, which allows you to perform 1 additional task. Also bear in mind that there is no possible way, at least by the rules, to allow you to perform a second combat task. You can possibly perform more minor actions. I believe that's by spending momentum, but this is the only way that you can actually perform an additional task by also spending 2 momentum. I mean, there's not much I can say about these combat momentums. This is something that has to be really played out and really tested on actual play session to really see what are some of the potentially good ones and what are potentially not as great ones, or at least how the application really works on the table as compared to just reading them in theory. So I think we'll just move on to the next and probably the final section for tonight's session. Alright, types of attack. Weapons and other forms of attack, as well as the damage caused by hazards, have a few common traits and values that determine the specifics of how they function. The key elements of a weapon are what type of weapon it is, its damage rating, the weapon's size, and any qualities it possesses that influence how it is used. So type, this will either be melee or range, determining how the weapon is used. Damage rating, this will be the number of challenge dice and possibly 1 or more damage effects that trigger when effects are rolled. All weapons gain additional challenge dice to their damage rating equal to the security discipline of the character. So that's actually a pretty big deal. As you remember, if security discipline can range between the number 1 to 5, so that's actually a pretty big boost, especially given to characters with high disciplines. I guess if we look at a good example, it would be the chief of security. She has a security of 4, so that's actually a huge boost because that adds 4 challenge dice to her weapons, and that may explain why her challenge dice is actually so high as compared to the other characters. And now there just needs to be a clarification of, is this the total number after adding the security discipline or before that, because I believe there may be some characters who have a security just as high as hers. Let's see, security 1, 2, security 3, which is also pretty high, and security 2 and security 2. Alright, so the medical officer actually has a very significant high security as well, and if you look at her damage, yeah, her damage seems to be pretty much on par with the security officer, and that makes it higher than even the first officer, I believe, because unarmed strike of 3, whereas the medical officer has an unarmed strike of 4, possibly, you know, attributed to security. So just by guessing, I'm guessing this numbers has already concluded adding the security. So if a player asks like, do I add 4 plus 3, or is it already a total? That is something I think that can be clarified within, you know, within the pre-gen, or, you know, just by stating here that the numbers already been added, because, you know, it's just one less areas of dispute between player and GM of what exactly the rules is talking about. Alright, size. Weapons will either be one-handed or two-handed. A two-handed weapon can be used in one hand to make an attack, but the difficulty increases by 1. Okay, so that's a distinction, but something to bear in mind if somebody wants to use a two-handed weapon one-handed. Although it's probably not the right time to think about it, but will be the question of cropping up of what happens if I use it dual wielding. You know, because some players just want to be fancy that way, which I think at this point it would be prudent to use 2 one-handed weapons, because if you have to switch a two-handed weapon to a one-handed weapon, then you're just making things difficult for yourself. Alright, and then we have qualities. These are any additional rules setting up restrictions or benefits that apply to the weapon's use. So I'm guessing the qualities will be answered here under damage effects. The following abilities provide additional benefits whenever an effect is rolled on the challenge dice. See challenge dice on page 7. When one or more effects are rolled, all damage effects that apply to that attack are used. So I'm guessing this line is important because it's not really a matter of choice. It has to be applied. And this is interesting because this only occurs if there is an effect roll on the challenge dice. So remember, when you roll for damage, there is a possibility of getting effects. So what do the effects mean? I guess is where we're going to we'll be reading the rest of, but I don't recall any of the weapons in the pre-gens having an effect. Or they do, like non-lethal charge. Let's see, there's non-lethal charge, and then we have vicious, we have charge, we have non-lethal, we have charge, non-lethal, and non-lethal charge, and we have non-lethal charge. So I guess those are the ones that will be the most important to look at. Non-lethal charge, or although we shouldn't and vicious is the other one, although I guess we shouldn't be ignoring the others, but we'll pay a bit more attention to non-lethal and charge for now, because that's probably the one that's going to be most common. Okay, so area. The attack covers a wide area and can affect several targets at the same time. The attack automatically affects any target or damageable object within reach of the initial target. It also affects one additional target within close range of the initial target. For each effect result on the damage on a challenge dice, starting with the closest as determined by the game master. If one or more complications are rolled when using an area attack, the game master may choose to use the complication to have the attack applied to an ally in the area of the attack. A target cannot be hit if it would have been more difficult to hit than the initial target. So everything here seems to make sense. You can only affect one additional target within close range for each effect. Starting with the closest, there's the general guideline that's provided by the game master. Complications that arise can be used to apply to an ally instead of the target. The only one that I'm not quite sure is a target cannot be hit if it would be more difficult to hit than the initial target. I'm not exactly sure what is this line supposed to protect from, because at most I'm thinking is something along the lines that something that affects difficulty. Does it mean that if the initial target is more difficult to hit, therefore it cannot affect other targets in the area? Or if if these other targets are in some kind of position where they are harder to hit, then they cannot be affected. So I'm not exactly sure. I'll, I'll probably try to keep this in mind, but I need to see a good example of how this reading appears in effect. Alright, so we move on. We have intense. The attack is designed to inflict massive harm on a target, incapacitating them far more effectively. The cost to avoid injury caused by intense weapon increases by 1 for each effect roll. This is a random number. If let's say I roll 3 effects and technically 3 damage, the cost to avoid an injury becomes 5, which is being 2 base plus 3 for the effects roll. That can actually be quite deadly in its own sense, because increasing the cost for avoiding an injury may go to an extent that it actually goes beyond the possible pool that the character has at the moment. So that can actually be quite lethal. Alright, we have knockdown. If one or more effects are rolled on this attack, then the target is not prone. The target may resist this effect by adding a number of points to threat equal to the number of effects rolled. For non-player characters, the character must spend points from threat instead of adding to threat. Alright, so that pretty much makes sense. Knockdown. So the way this is worded is that knockdown only applies if there is more than one or more effects. And I think we might have seen one of the weapons that has this effect from the pre-gens. But that's something to bear in mind, that knockdown is only mostly a secondary effect that comes into play after maybe a prior effect. But that also raises the question that if knockdown is the only effect that that the weapon has, does it always assume that it always knocks down a character with only one effect? I believe it is so, because it says one or more. So even if you only get one effect, then you can knock someone down with it. The interesting thing is that you can resist knocking down by using threats, but it has to be paid equal to the number of effects rolled. So therefore, even if let's say, and this is something that's not avoidable with momentum. So that's an interesting point. Alright, piercing. The attack ignores X points of the target's total resistance for each effect roll. Alright, so this is not, so piercing is not a fixed number that is automatically overcomes resistance. It has to be an effect that has to be rolled. So that's fine. Vicious is quite the opposite. The attack inflicts X additional damage for each effect roll. So that's actually pretty dangerous, given the character the pre-gen who has it. If we just have a quick look, she has a vicious of 6. So she has 6 challenge dice for Ushan Tor with a vicious of 1. So it can deal one more damage for each effect roll, and in this case she has a potential of rolling 6. So if we look at her 6 challenge dice, her potential maximum damage is 12 damage. But if she rolls all 6 to be 6/1 with an effect, she still deals the equal amount of damage of 12. So that's actually quite a lot. That's actually quite dangerous too. Or in other words, in the case for this character, basically her results, she has a higher probability of getting 2 damage for each challenge dice that she rolls, given the nature of vicious 1. I'm guessing the number is supposed to increase. For example, if it were vicious 2, then every effect that she rolls would be 2 damage. So we are looking at a very exponential increase here, from 6 damage from vicious 1 to 12 damage on vicious 2, plus the 6 that's already rolled. So that's about 18 damage in total if this was a vicious 2 weapon. Alright, so let's go back. So we have qualities. So we have not encountered a charge and intense yet. So I'm guessing that's down to, those are effects. These are effects, and now we are going into qualities. Alright, the following qualities alter the way a weapon functions in a variety of ways. Accurate. The weapon is especially precise, often incorporating additional sights. If the character performs the A minor action before making an attack with this weapon, then any number of d20s may be rerolled instead of the normal benefit of aiming. So let's just make a quick comparison. So this allows for any number of d20s to be rerolled, whereas a normal aiming action will only allow a single d20 to be rerolled. So that's actually a significant increase in what accurate weapon can do. Okay, coming back to charge. The weapon has an adaptable energy supply, allowing its potency to be charged to different levels. If the character performs a prepare minor action before attacking with this weapon, one of the following weapon damage effects may be used in the attack: area, intense piercing 2, or vicious 1. So that's actually okay. That's quite a lot of flexibility and versatility to the weapons given, but at the cost of using a prepare minor action. So that would mean that they would be taking up the entire character's entire slots for conflict actions, just to adjust their weapon to do what it wants them to do. So there's a lot of technical value with using a charged weapon, and based on the pre-gens, every character has that. So I'm guessing it's a question of that's the default settings of the phases this as seen in the shows, and there's actually there's a lot of situations that the players can adapt to by just changing the settings of their phases to whatever they want it to do. And fortunately enough, all of that is being covered under the deep damage effects. So the characters are actually being given an item that has a lot of effects built into it, as long as they make the appropriate actions to adjust them. Alright, the cumbersome. The weapon takes patience and precision to use effectively. The weapon cannot be used to attack you unless a prepare minor action is performed during the same turn. Alright, so cumbersome is the ugly cousin of the charge weapon, where the prepare minor action becomes compulsory rather than an option. Deadly. The weapon is designed to kill. If the character attempts to make a non-lethal attack with this weapon, the difficulty of the attack increases by 1. Alright, debilitating. Medicine task to perform first aid on characters injured by this weapon or to heal injuries from this weapon increases in difficulty by 1. Alright. Hidden X. The weapon is easy to conceal or disguise as something else. When the weapon is hidden, any search of the owning character requires an insight plus security or reason plus security task with a difficulty of X to find the weapon. The character may use a minor action to conceal a hidden weapon. Okay, so the weapon's difficulty is determined by its quality of hidden X, X being any number, and it needs an insight security or reason security task to find it. I would like to see this example being used in the adventure that comes with it, because this might be a more interesting quality that is used outside of combat. Although it does say that you can use a minor action to conceal a hidden weapon. Alright, we have inaccurate. The weapon is imprecise and clumsy, and very little can be done to change that. The A minor action gives no benefit when making an attack with this weapon. So in other words, if you're using inaccurate weapon, there is no point of taking the aim action that allows you to reroll 1 dice. Yeah. Alright, non-lethal. The weapon is debilitating rather than deadly. If the character attempts to make a lethal attack with this weapon, the difficulty of the attack increases by 1. So this is the opposite of deadly. And I guess and since this is the quality that's carried in all the phases of the pre-gens, they will most likely be encouraged in a situation where they would not want to make a lethal attack. Yes, and which is probably in line with Starfleet's policies when it comes to conflicts. So it would be interesting to see if there's any scenario that forces players to have to make lethal attacks. and have to kill someone because they have a, not just they not just have be breaking policy, but they also be making a relatively more difficult attack with their ranged weapon. So I believe that should be about it. That's all of the rules chapters of the Star Trek Adventures Quick Start Guide. The next section is already talking about the Quick Start mission that comes with the book, and as I mentioned before, I will not be doing a read through session of the adventure to be included in this series of videos. But then, as well as I said, if I find anything interesting that explains any rules that's being read prior to it, then I may make a special video just on that. But as always, no promises on this sort of thing. Overall, I would say the rules that I've read so far, I guess at least for today's sessions, most of them eventually gets covered, especially when it comes to damage effects and the qualities. Although there are still stuff like a resistance dice, and immediate spans of momentum. Some of that still borders on a little bit of being a little bit unclear exactly what is it that it's actually being talked about. I think that opposed task is also another concept that was not really fully explained, and I'll probably go back to read the earlier sections of the quick start just to see if I miss anything. But in any case, I think combat seems interesting. It has some different layers to it. The best way to learn a combat system as for me is always to actually run an actual scenario, whether an example scenario or during the actual game itself. And I hope that they would have at least one combat scene in the adventure in itself, even though that's probably not the usual way of how a episode of Star Trek usually ends up with. But quick starts are gateways for you to learn the rules, so it would be prudent to have an example where that all the rules that have been learned so far or that's provided in the rules can be tested at some point. So I guess that's it for the Star Trek Adventures Quick Start Guide. If anyone has any comments about the series, or have any thoughts, or have any clarifications to offer, or have any opinions and thoughts about the system in itself, whether in its quick start form or its core rules form, or any general words of encouragement, will be much appreciated in the comments if you care to give any. So I guess this will be the Questing GM signing out for now.